sort of goes into the talk that I'm about to give, so I will go on with the talk. The 5 habits of successful lean organizations. And I'm going to talk about them as purpose, passion, persistence, pride, and profit. What Owen asked me to do was to talk about what does success look like. When you have lean that really clicks and really works, what does success look like? So I was talking about it with Tom, and he said, well, it's not just a list of successful Agile implementations, because it has to be a list of successful organizational implementations. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if you have successful software, if you don't have successful overall results from it. So that's why I changed it from successful development to successful organizations. And I'll start with one of my current favorite, what I'll call successful lean organizations. It's Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines is a kind of an interesting example. It's oftentimes been attempted to be mimicked, rarely successfully. And James Parker, former CEO and the second CEO of the company, wrote a book called Doing the Right Thing. And he said, you know, I'm going to tell you the secret of Southwest Airlines, but I don't think it's going to hurt us because nobody's going to believe it. And in fact, Southwest has been a very successful and profitable airline. Its employees love to work there. When Southwest started, it had the lowest, it was unionized, but had the lowest salaries in the industry. And all of the other airlines, every time Southwest would come into their airport, had to lower their fares. And so then the airline started going bankrupt, and all of its competitors have gone bankrupt, and renegotiated their salary structures with their cabin attendants and pilots and mechanics. And now Southwest Airlines has the highest salary structure in the industry in the U.S., but it also has the most productive labor force. It pays the least amount of money per person flying of any of the places in the industry. And one of the reasons is because it has extremely happy and employees that work very hard to make sure that the airline is successful. He says, Jim Parker says, that the secret to success, and don't mind if I tell everybody because you're not going to believe us, is to take good care of your employees, because then they will take good care of your customers, and satisfied customers lead to successful business. So it's employees first, customers second, and shareholders third. And that's something that Kelleher, who was the original CEO, said many times. And the stock market didn't actually believe him, but then the company started being quite successful in the stock market. So that's the secret to a really good lean organization. It's all about people, because people create happy customers, satisfied customers, and satisfied customers create business success. So he said, focus on 3 things. Create a great place to work, provide customers with what they really want, and make sure that the airline always makes a profit so that it can stay in business for the long term. Okay, it's not stay in business to make money. It's make money to stay in business. So there's a big difference there. So that's what I'll call a lean organization that's very successful. And there are several of the others around there. I'll sort of wrap up with a few more. So the 5 habits of successful lean development are purpose. The people coming to work in the morning need to know why they're coming. Passion. When you have a purpose, then you can generate passion. Persistence. That is, keep on getting better. Pride. When we go around and talk to companies, when people are proud of the way they work and the work they do and their company, then we always find a successful company. Pride is an interesting sort of indicator of success. And profit. Because if you don't make enough money to stay in business, it isn't going to do you any good. So I'm going to start out with purpose. And I'm going to talk about a company in Norway that I think is probably the gold standard of making sure that employees understand the purpose of the company. This is Timber. They make these big screens that you talk to other people on. It's sort of like being in the same room. They're doing really well in the environment where there's not much money for travel. And we toured there 4 years ago, something like that. And we talked to a person who invited us in, and his name is Olaf, and he said, So I'm just a C++ programmer here, but I just want to tell you about our company. See this screen here? And he pointed to a smaller screen than this. Everything we do in this company is to make it possible for people to communicate using this screen. And he went on to tell about how his programming worked and what kinds of stuff he did to make that work. And then he had a vice president come and talk to us, who started out his, hello, good morning, I just want to tell you about our company. Everything we do is to make it possible for people to communicate using this screen. And here's the kind of companies that buy it, here's their market, here's the market potential, and so on. And then Olaf took us on a tour. And we went into an area where they were designing and building hardware, and there was somebody that looked like she was testing some hardware, so Olaf said, would you please tell Tom and Mary what you're doing? And so she said, well, everything we do in this company is to make it possible for people to communicate using these kinds of screens. And we are, we have bought OEM cameras in the past, but we've decided to put a low-cost system on the market. And we know that in order for the screens to work right, it has to have thus and such a resolution and thus and such a refresh rate. And we can't find a camera on the market at the price point we're willing to pay for a low-cost system that's going to match our criteria, so we're making our own. And here's the camera. I'm testing it now. It has thus and such a refresh rate and thus and such a resolution. And here's the problems that we're going to solve in the next month. It was really amazing. And then I went into a project team, and the project team was doing menus. And they said, well, everything we do is to make it possible for people to communicate using the screen. And what you don't want is you don't want a screen that is a menu system that's annoying people so they can't communicate. And the other thing about it is that every single time this is used, it's going to be used around the world. So you can be sure that there will be multiple languages being used at all of the different places. So we, of course, are in Norway, and we have 7 or 8 languages on any team anyway, so our menus are naturally in multiple languages, so that's where we have a great advantage over our competitors in the US, and so on. So they went on like that. Every single person there knew the purpose of why they were doing their job. And, I mean, right down to the tester of the camera in the lab. And that's what I mean by understanding purpose. He says, Olaf says, it's a great company because we think of programmers and sales purpose people as being the most important and respected positions. Everybody else is there to support it. So he said, we do 2 things in this company. We make great stuff and we sell it. And therefore, everybody else, managers, vice presidents, are there in support of the engineers and the salespeople. And vice president told us the same thing. So that's what I mean by purpose. I give 2 more cases. And this is what I'm going to call developer on site. So many times you talk about an agile team and you're thinking about a developer team and maybe somebody telling them what to do. Instead, in these 2 cases, we think about a much bigger team. The first case is Standard Life. Tom and I taught our very first class at Standard Life in 2003. And we talked to some of the executives there, and they got in their head the concept that a whole bunch of software is not ever used. And I was telling them that, and the CIO was thinking, oh, yeah, what bad companies write all this software that's never used? And then I said, well, actually, your developers, who we talked to the day before, think it's like 60 or 70% in your company. So he was thrown for a loop. He talked to his developers, and they decided that they were writing a whole bunch of stuff that customers didn't use. So what they did was they put the developers into the business teams. They actually sat by, they said, why do we have developers over here and the people with problems over here? So think about selling insurance. What you need is you need your salespeople to have the screens they need in order to do it. And so what they did was they put developers in the business teams. And then whenever there was a change needed, the developers immediately made a change or went back to their team and had got this change if it was bigger. And because of that, they were able to outsell their competitors dramatically. And in fact, they had from the time they started it, 71% jump in operating profit and 31% rise in new business. Now, this is also due to a very good service-oriented architecture that was just about to be deployed when we were there. They had a really good development group. We've also been to Wells Fargo mortgage processing, where they take, the stack of papers you sign when you sign a mortgage? They scan them in. okay? And they store them in scanned format, and that's actually a sort of an operational job. How do we scan all of these papers really effectively? So they put in a lean process using a workflow software to manage it, and guess what? They couldn't get any changes in the workflow software. So they had very good lean teams that did lots of process improvement, but the day that they wanted anything changed in the software, they couldn't make it happen. Because the software people had much bigger fish to fry than worrying about the lean teams. And we went and did the class there, and then one of the lean team leaders said, we request change after change after change, and nobody helps us. So what they did was they put developers on the lean teams and let them do whatever the lean team asked for. And the vice president called us some weeks later and said, it's just amazing. You know, those teams, when they set out to do anything, they make it happen. Nothing can get in their way. Nothing can stop them from making the changes that are necessary. So this is a concept of having a purpose for doing development. And then you get people that are really interested in it. So I think one of the things is that developers should go and see what they're doing, what the problem is. It's called ethnography. And it's not somebody else's job. It's the job of the people who have to think about how they're going to solve the problem to understand what the problem is that they're solving. So developers should talk directly with customers. They should ask questions. They should, as a group, they should model ideas, discuss them, both before they get started and while they're developing a product. Intermediaries, in my opinion, are not adequate. One interesting case, even in commercial software you can do this. You don't go to every customer, but Intuit has had this Follow Me Home program since 1980s, early 80s. And that's where somebody goes into a store, buys a box of this financial software, and they take it home, and about half a dozen team members, developers, marketing people, you name it, walk home with them and watch them install it in their home and ask them questions as they're doing it. So they do this a lot. All of the people in the company try to do a Follow Me Home every couple years. And one time we met somebody who had done this. He was, at this point, a manager, a fairly senior manager of a company in Atlanta. But he said when he was a young developer, he did a Follow Me Home. And it influenced his way he thought about software development for the rest of his life. Because it was so revealing to watch what really happened with the stuff you did, instead of imagining how, you know, having your mental model not match what the customer's mental model is. So having the user's mental model match with the developer's mental model is really important, and having developers have a purpose when they come into work is really important. That's why having the team that's developing work get to understand the problem itself and make their own decisions about how to do it and what's important is, I think, a really important thing that we got to think about. And we see that in lean environments that are successful. And then we see passion. So you saw that picture of the train. And the reason why Tom was able to get that picture on Sunday morning is because photography is his passion. And we chase pictures whenever we're not doing this talking stuff. That's what we spend our time doing, is chasing pictures. And he's really good at getting them because, yes, we were lucky. The opportunity was perfect, the snow on the trees, you know. Buddy also stood there in the freezing cold for half an hour waiting for that train, and so on. And we had spent 2 nights on a nearby lodge just to be able to take pictures in that area. So passion is not just being lucky. It's being so involved in what it is that you do that you really spend all the time necessary to get really good at it. We had a team that we met that was very passionate. It's probably the most passionate group we ever gave a class to. You know of Ubuntu, okay? This was the group that was creating Launchpad, which is the tool set for Ubuntu. There were about 40 of them. They were from absolutely around the world, and they programmed in classic open source style, even though they were being paid to do the Launchpad thing. Launchpad has subsequently gone open source, but at this point it wasn't. And it was interesting because the question was, in my mind, what could we teach them? It was a really interesting question. Because certainly we couldn't teach them about iterations. They were already doing very effective 1-month iterations. And certainly we couldn't teach them about co-location because that wasn't in the cards. There were 2 people in the same place in Brazil, and otherwise every time zone, every country you can imagine was represented in that room. They didn't even think about working together. Their style was very successful, and it was all about text-based communication, and in an open source community, that problem was solved. We couldn't teach them about process. They had a very rigorous process of, first of all, in very small increments, writing a spec, having it reviewed outside of the team where it was written, and then coding the spec, having that reviewed outside the team. And this is not pair programming, this is outside the team where it was written, and then having a final database check and then deployment, all within multiple of these within a month. And they weren't going to change that process just because there was something that was a little easier. This was one they were proud of, and it was absolutely fundamental to their thinking process. And we couldn't teach them test-driven development because they could have taught any Agile team around all they needed to know about test-driven development. So what we did do is we taught them about flow through the process and about constant improvement. Because with this process of these reviews, they were not making stuff flow very fast, so stuff would get sort of stuck and lost. And also, they didn't have a way to think about how we keep improving the way we do things. We did an interesting exercise, and by the time we walked out of there, we did a 1-hour constant improvement exercise. They had already 4 things that they were going to try when they got home the next Monday, and they did. I heard that something like a month later, they had to pull half of them off to put them on another project, and the half of them that were left continued to at the same rate and the same amount of software as the 40 had done before, because the increase in flow and the ability to constantly improve really sort of doubled their productivity. So there wasn't any particular tool. There was the thinking about flow and improvement. And so they were very, very passionate about putting together something that would be useful, like Ubuntu. And they were passionate about creating open source software. So that question I had then was, what could they teach us? And they did teach us something very interesting, because one of their managers, whose nickname is Kiko, and that's the only name I know him by from Brazil, he came to Agile 2008 in Toronto, and he did a workshop with me. And at that workshop, he talked about open source style, how it works, and he said, you know, sometimes we test and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we document, sometimes we don't. But one thing that makes us different than anybody else who develops software is we care. That's what makes people who develop open software different. They care about what they're doing. And that reminded me of a quote from Michael Feathers, who's around here somewhere, and I warned him I was going to do this. So in Bob Martin's book on clean code, a handbook for software craftsmanship, he has a list of quotes of people who say, this is what clean code is all about. And Michael said, I could list all of the qualities that I notice in clean code, but there's one overreaching quality that leads to all of them. Clean code always looks like it was written by someone who cares. There's nothing obvious that you can do to make it better. All of those things were thought about by the code's author, and if you try to imagine improvements, you're led back to where you are, sitting in appreciation of the code someone left you. Code written by somebody who cared deeply about the craft. Again, we care. So the concept of passion is caring about doing a really excellent job, and doing and constantly getting better at doing a really excellent job. So I was thinking about that and thinking about what causes people to constantly get better and increase their expertise and their excellence. And then I ran across the theory of expertise. Question is, what makes people really good at what they do? And this guy named Anders Ericsson from Stockholm, who now lives in Florida, started thinking about that in the 80s. And in 1993, he published a research report called The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance. That paper, it was about how violin players in Berlin, the difference between experts and non-experts. And it all boiled down to this thing called deliberate practice, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And that paper triggered a whole bunch of additional research. So by 2006, there was an 800-page book on the Cambridge Handbook of Expertise and Expert Performance. I have it. It talks about every kind of area that you can imagine, from doctors doing diagnosis to software engineering to you name it. There's over 15 years of research that's led to remarkably consistent findings across a wide array of fields, and that is the most accomplished people need around 10 years of deliberate practice to become world-class. And it does not matter the environment, but it's such a well-known well-established pattern that is called the 10-year rule. So deliberate practice, 10 years or 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Where 10 years and 10,000 hours are equivalent is 3 hours a day, because deliberate practice is so exhausting, at least that's what they found in, in sports and in music and stuff, that 3 hours a day is about all you can do. The musicians in Berlin always took a nap because they could then practice more aggressively in the afternoon than their colleagues who are not going to be quite so world class. So what you do with deliberate practice is you identify a specific area that needs improvement. Okay? I mean, you can think about a musician or an athlete with a teacher. And devise or learn from a teacher, and at the beginning for sure you learn from a teacher, a focused exercise to improve that particular skill, which you're not so good at. And you just keep practicing at it until you get good. And you get immediate feedback. And you constantly adjust based on the immediate feedback every time you practice. And you focus on pushing the limits, which means you're not going to be successful all the time. The idea is not to be successful, it's to push the limits. And you practice regularly and intensely, perhaps 3 hours a day. And that's where you can think about open source actually provides an environment of deliberate practice. Right down to the feedback. Because in open source, when you commit, you go through a committer, and the committer tells you if it's okay or not. But not only that, as soon as you actually get past a committer, you get the whole community dumping on you about how terrible your code is. So if you want to get really good in software development, I've been told, try open source. So we've got to wonder, do we do anything like that in our organizations? Deliberate practice applies to athletes, Olympic athletes, it applies to musicians, and it applies to software development too. So how do we get good at doing what we're doing? There's 4 elements, and you got to think, how do you create these elements we see in really good lean success stories? Number 1 is that there is a teacher of some sort for junior people coming into the company. They're not just tossed into a team and said, have a go. They have mentors and teachers making sure that they learn the ropes. Number 2, people are provided with challenges. You don't do the same thing every day. You don't always get assigned to what you're good at. You have challenges. Number 3, there's immediate feedback on how well you're doing. And 4, you have to be persistent. You know, the difference in world-class and non-world-class performance in the end oftentimes boils down to just that, keeping at it, persistence, okay? So, persistence. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Here is what I'll call Dijkstra's challenge. Oscar Dijkstra said this in 1968. He said, if you want more effective programmers, you will discover that they should not waste their time debugging. They should not introduce bugs to start with. Yes? Okay. So, really good software doesn't allow defect injection in the first place. But average software assumes that defects will be injected and fixes them later. Yes? But I was with Tom Gill in Berlin a month ago, 3 weeks ago, I don't know, something like that. And he said, you know, I've tried all this stuff about code inspections. He used to make his living on inspections, and they don't work. Inspections don't work. If you inject bugs in the first place, you can't ever get rid of them. So you need a process that doesn't let that happen. Now, this is something you have to be very persistent at, because today, probably, you're putting bugs in code. Probably everybody is. But think about this. When you have a release cycle, okay, I don't know, whatever length, 6 months, 3 months, whatever, what percentage of this release cycle do you spend after you freeze the code, hardening the system? Testing, fixing, UAT, whatever it takes to get from when you start working on the software to when the user actually starts getting value from it. Okay, and I don't mean release to users, I mean the user starts getting value. Typically, we see 30%. So if it's a 6-month cycle, 2 months in test. If it's a 3-month cycle, 1 month in test. That's pretty typical. Sound familiar? Now sometimes we see 50%. So this is not a defect mistake-proof process. This is a process that assumes defect injection and allows plenty of time to fix them. So what you need to do from a persistence point of view is you got to figure out how to move the defects from being found here to being found there. That's just fundamental. You got to move all of this stuff, and it's not going to happen tomorrow, But over time, what we've seen is the top companies that we've talked to eventually get to less than 10% of time spent in final verification. Now, that's not saying no verification. It's saying verification should not be expected to discover defects. You should have in your mind that the biggest defect is tolerating defects. You have to find a mechanism where you do not inject defects in the first place. And you should be surprised when you find defects here. And when you find them, your whole purpose should be how to find them earlier the next time. So that's Dijkstra's challenge. I'm going to talk about a system that we ran into that met Dijkstra's challenge, I would say. This is reported by Nancy Van Schoenberg, and it's at both Agile 2004 and Agile 2006. And, you know, if you really want to see interesting code, look at embedded software. How many here do any kind of embedded software? That's fun, isn't it? I used to program process equipment. It wasn't embedded because our computers were like yay big, but same concept. And in this system, she had a novice team that had never done this kind of programming before. So she created standards and then had the team test to see how these standards would work. And over 3 years, they got better and better at never having defects injected in the first place. First of all, the technique was to have asserts in the code. You do this very often with embedded software. If you think about any kind of a card in a PC that you plug in, say something goes wrong. You can take a look and there'll be little lights, you know, and one of the lights or numbers or beat codes, whatever, will tell you more or less what's wrong. Now, asserts in embedded software are sort of like putting in little lights, so that when something goes wrong, you have a little tiny light to say, oh, this is what went wrong. And I can remember doing that when I was doing coding, but I never left them in because it would always slow stuff down in actual practice. But what she did was create a dual-targeted environment, bench testing, field testing. And in field testing, she left the asserts in and had an extremely short, quick buffer dump, very, very short, to say what happened when that assert failed. But if it was on the bench, it would probably come to a screeching halt or something like that. So with that technique, she found errors during debugging, but also in the field, she could figure out what caused things to go wrong. And guess what? The hardware people loved her. She said, you know, usually people hate, hardware and software people hate each other and they argue all the time. But because they had this little indicator of what happened when things failed, they had a way to understand it. And this was a coding standard. This was from the beginning, everybody coded in this manner. Secondly, because of the dual targeting, she could bracket all of the hardware code and mock it out and still do very, very good simulations in bench testing. And the other thing is that the hardware had to act in a certain way, and they were forever getting new cards, because this was, you know, one of those experimental programs. So what she did was create hardware drivers, which were effectively unit tests for the software drivers, hardware drivers, which were unit testing for hardware cards. And then she sent these drivers to the vendors with the new cards, and the cards had to pass the driver test before they got shipped and became part of the system. So basically, unit tests for the hardware. And also she did regular kind of domain level tests for communications, which you would find normal. And she also did special tests for the sophisticated algorithms, because what happens is, here's a grain harvester, and what this computer is doing is telling in the field how much protein, how much water, and that sort of stuff is in whatever's being harvested. And so there were lots of sophisticated mathematical algorithms in there that she also tested. He did, 40,000 lines of code. And although I don't actually like lines of code as a measurement, this is an interesting relative measurement. So she's using Kokomo standards here and trying to decide whether or not they were more productive or less productive against typical embedded software stuff based on Kokomo standards. And what they found out, interestingly enough, was that they had, over a 3-year project, 51 total bugs. That's pretty interesting. Less than 2 bugs active at any time. So you don't actually need a defect list when you have less than 2 bugs active at any point in time. And you can do a root cause analysis of every single one, which they did. 30 defects were removed, 21 escaped to the first test. Their quality, therefore, was 2,000% above industry norm. And their productivity, by the way, was about 300% over industry norm. So, and that always goes together. The high quality and high productivity are always paired. And the interesting thing she said is that there was no correlation between the size of the code base and the number of defects, which means complexity was completely controlled with her techniques here. So she started out by not accepting the concept of defects and did pretty well. Here is the picture of what happened over the 3 years. Year 1, year 2, year 3, and you can see that there were 18 total critical defects, 20 moderate ones, and 19 cosmetics of the 52. So that's what I mean by don't tolerate defects being injected into the code. Now, you're not there now, probably, but you need to get there. You need to stop accepting the concept that a third or half or more of our development cycle is spent finding and fixing errors. You have to find and fix them as they're coded, and to me that's a fundamental concept in Lean. Quality is done by construction, it's not done by testing. Another interesting thing that happens in a good Lean organization is that people think for themselves. Way too often, we have people say, give us examples of what other companies do so that we can do it like them. But guess what? You have your own individual environment, and other people's solutions to their problems are not necessarily the right solution to your problem. So a good Lean organization has learned how to think for itself. And I'm going to give you an example. This one is Amazon.com. Most of this information is from published information on the web. And I started doing this because of Michael Nygaard was telling us about cloud computing in Minneapolis some months ago. And I said, Amazon.com, what are they doing with cloud computing? They are a retail store, for heaven's sake. So their IT department is now a profit center. Can you imagine how neat it would be if you're a CIO and your IT department becomes a profit center? Like, this is the dream, but they've managed to do it. And what their CTO, Werner Vogel, says is that they learned one thing, that they started out in '95 and they had a kind of a so-so environment, and then they discovered that they were successful, okay? So, whoa, boy, and they had to scale. They had a very standard big front end, big front back end thing, and they kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And every single year at the holiday season, they would just pretty much fall off a cliff, just about. They'd come screeching halt right at the edge. And in January, they would get together, the executive team would get together in a room and they'd say, whew, glad we got through that one. Seconds of relax and then, what are we going to do next year, okay? Because it was like going that way, totally exponential. So in the end, what they finally decided was that they needed to buy a new mainframe, and they did, and it slowed things down. Okay, well that was not going to work. What they decided was that they were so big and growing so fast that there was no model out there that they could follow. They had to invent it themselves. And what they invented was a transition to services. Amazon.com now is services. They don't actually have databases. Every service owns its own database, or data structures. Oh, so you hit their page, their home page, you probably hit 100 services. They have base services, they have consolidator services, and that's how they run. The interesting thing about these services, and the services have like a service agreement, service level agreement with the other services that hit it. Basically, how fast they'll respond under what kind of load. And each service is owned by a 2-pizza team. 2 pizzas, a team that can be fed with 2 pizzas. Okay, you know, got it? And that's because Jeff Bezos, the CEO, happens to believe in 2 pizza teams. That's his thing. And he believes that if you have 2 pizza teams, then you have people that can talk to each other and make stuff happen. And the other interesting thing about these 2 pizza teams is that they do everything cradle to grave. So a 2 pizza team does the what are we supposed to do, decide what they're going to do, actually does any kind of architecture, any type of coding, any type of testing, and all operations. Because they discovered that like 66% of all of their time was spent in operations, not in development, so they wanted the operations people on the development team. So they have the operations people on the development team. Now that's really why they had to invent the cloud, so that these little teams could have their, independent little places to do. They don't actually have standards for a team on what the team has to use for any of their tools. Because Bezos believes that at huge scale, if you don't have a whole bunch of independent agents out there that can make their own creative decisions, you can't grow. And so that's why all of these two-pizza teams. Now, that doesn't mean everything's easy. They have issues with testing, and they have to be very creative about that. But they have huge number of independent agents making their own decisions and growing the way that things work. It took 2001 to 2008, 7 years to get this actually in place. Long time. And meanwhile, they're not looking out for everybody else and how are they doing it. They're saying, what do we have to do to succeed in our world? Vogel says there's something interesting about their world. And that is, he says, if you need to do anything under high load with failures occurring, and you need to reach an agreement, you're lost. So what happens with a database that's a repository is you need to reach an agreement. You need to lock it out. And you will always, over time, have failures which will cause a lockup. So he has something that he calls eventual agreement, which is you don't actually have to reach agreement with the other services. If you can't because they're down or something, you proceed, you allow somebody to put it into the shopping basket or whatever, and eventually you might have to tell the customer, oh, sorry, it doesn't exactly exist. So their idea is eventual agreement rather than having everything have to agree at the same time, because it will cause lockups. If you're going to have one lockup every couple billion transactions, if you have a couple billion transactions a minute, you have one lockup a minute. So at scale, you can't force everybody to agree. But there's something else very interesting about that. You've heard of Conway's Law? Conway's Law says that organizations, this is in Datamation in 1968, organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of the organization. Right? So guess what? Two pizza teams and services are copies of the communication structure of the Amazon.com organization. And they don't have to reach agreement. Neither do the service little teams have to reach agreement, nor do the services themselves have to reach agreement. So they are strong believers in small independent agents that allow growth and scale. Otherwise, Bezos doesn't think they'll ever be able to scale. Now, this doesn't say that you have to have independent two pizza teams in order to be successful, but it does say that if you think your architecture cannot match your team structure, you're probably kidding yourself. You will probably have to have the same kind of architecture and organizational structure over time. And if you have a monolithic organizational structure or hierarchical one, guess what? Your software will probably look the same way. And similarly, if you think about open source, one of the interesting things about it, it is probably the flattest and most distributed type of software there is because the organizational structure is just distributed around the world. So that's persistence. Keep getting better. Think for yourself and become really expert, and also figure out how to create expertise inside of the organization. So the next thing we see is pride. And I'm going back to Tandberg for this one because I think it's a really interesting case. So this is their Code 90. It was 20 months from idea to production. This is a video multiplexer, audio video multiplexer, I think. Okay. They started it in spring of 2007. Their first hardware prototype was in mid-2008. They released it in late 2008. And they had somewhere between 55 and 65 people at any given time. Of that, maybe 3/4 were software developers. So that's what it took. And they just made it happen, as Olaf says. Here's his, by the way, these slides will be available on your website, but here's what Olaf says. He says, here's what product development looks like at Tandberg. So if you want to see what a lean product development organization that works well looks like, think about this. He says, we spend very little energy on things that are not essential. And guess what? They figure out for themselves what is essential and what isn't. We do not follow a plan. We don't follow procedures. We don't write hours or keep track of hours. We don't measure project cost. Decisions are delayed as much as we can delay them so that we get as much information as we can. To fail is okay. Therefore, we deliver spectacular stuff. Now think about that. If you don't push the limits, you don't get spectacular performance. Doers are very much respected at Tandberg. We hire and keep exceptional people. I've heard way too many times, we got 10,000 people, so on the average, they're average. Okay, I'm sorry, but you actually can focus on hiring and retaining exceptional people. And if you want average software, well, okay, then accept that there's going to be average people. But if you want brilliant software, figure out how to hire and maintain the kind of exceptional people your organization needs. Every time we go to really successful lean organizations, they have exceptionally good people. By the way, when we gave that class at Standard Life, we had 20 of their developers in our class with an average of 16 years with the company, and they were amazing. They were really good. So it wasn't just an accident that they put the developers in and got all this good stuff. They had exceptional people. Communication is a key skill for all engineers. I've heard too many times, oh, we're introverts, we can't talk. Sorry, I'm not buying that, because when I was an engineer, my boss didn't buy it. So okay, you don't know how to communicate, here's your class for you, okay? Because we know that successful engineers learn first and foremost how to present their ideas to others. I can remember the first class because I went to a class and they videotaped, which was more new at the time, they videotaped our presentation at the end. And I can still see the presentation at the end. I was wearing these really long earrings and they were bouncing around and they bothered me. And I never wore earrings again after that. So it was you have to see yourself do it. So there was a training to become able to communicate. He said, we are fast and sloppy. Okay, now by sloppy, you don't get one of these things that really works to be really sloppy. But you don't really have to worry in some of your prototypes that everything's perfect. You figure out what you need to learn and learn fast with rapid feedback loops. We release early and we release often. Okay, I mean, this is a hardware environment. Most people in embedded software say, how can you do that? Well, actually, there are ways. Little documentation gives effective communication. Interesting. Okay. Slack is embedded. So we don't try to get full utilization out of people. It doesn't make any sense. And skunkworks projects are appreciated. The company builds on trust. Developers are treated as professionals, not resources. What an idea. We have fun and we have profit. So we follow principles, not processes. That's what Ola says. So to me, you want a picture of successful lean development organization. Here it is. Those are the kinds of things that we find in everyone that's successful. And that's not something that there's a formula for that you can impose and say, here's the program for next year, we're going to have this. That's a whole attitude and culture about how people are treated, what they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be spending their time, how they get engaged with customers. So let's talk about profit. Because you actually do have to make profit in order to stay in business. Otherwise, it's all, the company can't continue to provide the support. Now, there are some of you that actually work in an organization that doesn't make a profit, like, government organizations and stuff like that. But the interesting thing about making a profit is that it drives constraints on what you can and can't do and forces you to think within the kinds of constraints that cause good creative behavior to happen. So there's nothing wrong with constraints or a limited amount of money or anything like that. There's nothing wrong with good competition. In fact, Tom and I find that the best companies are the ones that have serious competition. So they have to be seriously creative. What do these companies have in common? Let's see. I talked about Southwest. Southwest is a really interesting company. And you've heard enough about Toyota that I don't need to say any more about that. Gore is an interesting company. They do Gore-Tex and many other products like that. And they have this theory of all parking lots are 250 cars. And if you fill up a parking lot, it's time to split the division. They don't actually have much of a reporting structure. People go in and choose their teams and choose their jobs, and it takes people a little while to figure out how it works there. But then they get to be very creative and do the kinds of things that they want. At 3M, we had a 15% rule. We figured Google stole their 20% rule from us, where 15% of your time was spent doing things that were creative, whatever you wanted. And it was the same way. You chose the team, you volunteered to work on stuff that was interesting to you. And if you want to find a great way for passion, that's the way, is to have people work on what they deeply care about. That's what happens at Gore. Nucor Steel is an interesting company. In '68, they just started up, and 20 years later, they kind of knocked Bethlehem Steel out of the world. And but in '68, they were just a little gnat, on Bethlehem Steel's radar screen. But they invented mini mills in steel, and they created all kinds of processes, mostly by the way that they treat the people and move people across plants so that they can come up with creative ideas. Semler Industries is in Brazil. Semler wrote the books Maverick and 7-Day Weekend, and they have a weird management structure also, where people kind of figure out their own jobs and figure out their own salaries. How does that work? Well, they're public, so you have to be careful what you want. And, okay, so I've talked to Tom, and I said, we really should talk about these companies. They're really, really interesting. And he says, yeah, but they're all outliers. Okay, and yeah, maybe they are all outliers, but they all have something in common. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Svenska Handelsbanken just for good luck, because we're, just coming out of a financial crisis, and this is a bank. It's a Swedish bank that was a kind of a 100-year-old normal Swedish bank in 1970, and they weren't doing too well. They were trying to be the biggest bank in Sweden and almost made it, but some crisis, which people don't seem to talk about, caused them to throw out their whole management structure and bring in a guy named Jan Wallander, who had a different idea about how to run the bank. So at Handelsbanken, the branch is the bank. Every branch is a complete bank in and of itself. And the branch manager owns responsibility for the branch, for how much it costs to produce income and how much income is produced. And they have a sort of a friendly internal competition, so to keep the branch managers competing against each other, but no kind of bonus system based on ranking. The only bonus is a company-wide bonus based on how well the bank does against other banks. And at each branch, you wonder, the interesting thing about this bank is that it has constantly grown, pretty much at the rate of other banks in Europe, until such time as there's an economic downturn. And during the economic downturn, all the other banks crash. Why? Because they have loans on them. And people cannot pay back the loans, so they go bankrupt, so the bank starts going. But for some reason, Handelsbanken's loans don't crash the same way that other loans do. They actually, they lose some money, but nowhere near as much as the others. So in the 1990s, it was the only bank that didn't have to go, during the economic downturn, out for any kind of funding, either from government or other or shareholders or anything. And in the most recent crash, same thing. They were loaning the Swedish government money to help prop up the other banks in Sweden. Because, guess what? In most banks, it's the top management. The bigger the loan, the higher the approval is. You cut great big loan has to go all the way up to the top. And in Handelsbanken, the loans are approved by the branch, who has expected to have a personal relationship with every loan. Even if it's a great big one and needs board approval, if the local manager is not behind it, it doesn't happen. And if it fails, it's the local branch manager who has to deal with it. It's not some corporate come in and figure out how to deal with defaults. So the branch managers are on the line for making good loans. And guess what? They make good loans. They don't have anything like the default. So every economic downturn, Handelsbanken steps ahead of the rest of them, and then they stay even until the next one, and then they go up and everybody else goes down. And so now they're one of the top 25 banks in Europe, absolutely the highest return to shareholders that there is of banks in Europe, and extremely successful. They've moved into other countries, especially countries which match their culture and their philosophy. They've gone into the UK and into some, I think Poland, I can't remember the other countries. Not where the best opportunity is, but where the best match for their approach is. So they're also in this group of companies that do this. They're very large, all of these companies are. Some, I can't remember how many billion euros, 9 billion euros or something like that of capital loans that they have up. They're consistently profitable when everybody else is not. And they dominate their industries, every single one of these. They might be outliers, but guess what? If you put them all in a package like this, you say, what do they do differently? Well, here's what they do differently. Frontline people are highly valued. They expect decisions to be made at a local team leader level. They are expected to make local decisions, and everybody, all the frontline people, are effectively engaged in delivering superior customer outcomes. So they create an environment where people understand the purpose, what they're supposed to do in order to deliver superior outcomes, and they are engaged in doing that. So they have two key advantages. The first advantage is that workers routinely dedicate their intelligence and their creativity to helping the company succeed. Wouldn't that be neat, right? If everybody in your organization came into work trying to figure out how they could make stuff better for the company. Actually, people try to do that, but then when they get scrunched because, oh, you're not supposed to think creatively, you're supposed to do what you're told, well, okay, I'll go be creative somewhere else. But these companies have figured out how to leverage that creativity and get the people that are coming into work, use their intelligence to come up with good ideas about how to make the company successful. And they support that. And therefore, the companies are adaptive. They detect and they can quickly respond to the market conditions and opportunities when they happen. So if you want a picture of what a good lean organization looks like, and I don't care if it's developing software like Tandberg or if it's developing something else, this is what they look like. This is the kind of thing that they do. They have a lot of similar things, a lot of stuff in common, but the fundamental thing that they do is that they have local people that are empowered to make local decisions with good local leadership. So I'm going to show you another piece of what Tom has done. This is in Argentina. No, actually it's in Chile. This is Torres de Paine. And this is another story of a 30-second opportunity that he managed to take advantage of. So with that, I actually have some time for questions, if there are any out there. Come on, there have to be questions.
How many people do you feed with 2 pizzas?
Okay, so this is U.S., so pizzas are big, right? 2 big pizzas. I think we're talking 8 to 10 or something like that. So imagine that, 8 to 10 people on a service. They do everything including operations. And in fact, Vogel says that if a service wants to be too big for a 2-pizza team, they break the service in half. The reason they break the service in half is because they believe that it's much more important to have effective team structures than to have the right structure for the service architecture. Yeah?
What kind of metrics did they use to measure
Okay, so I don't know the answer to that because most everything I know about Amazon is from publicly available stuff. But what I can tell you, what I do know, is that you're supposed to be on a 2-pizza team for at least 2 years. And I'm not sure that they worry about metrics on individuals. Okay, you're going to have to prove that, but I didn't see any indication that they did.
I'm curious how Bezos might, or someone at the management level might come to understand if his teams are passionate, or how does that?
Well, your service has to work, and you have a service level agreement. Bezos, it's interesting, at Amazon, everybody is expected to work on a call center for a week a year, or a week every 2 years, one or the other. It doesn't matter how high you are, even Bezos does it. And everybody is supposed to spend some time working in a fulfillment center. And last March, Bezos was in a fulfillment center and spent a week. It was in, I think, New Jersey. And the local newspaper got wind that Bezos was there, and so they decided to try it. And they were turned down by his office. They said, no, he's there to work. And he had a little mention of it in his report to shareholders. He said he really was encouraged by working in this fulfillment center because he could see, as a worker, all the opportunities for improvement. And he said, you know, and I kind of learned my place when I was cleaning up some stuff, and the local Kaizen leader came along and says, well, it's okay for you to clean that up, but have you tried to figure out the cause of it? And he said he felt like the Karate Kid. Learned a lesson. So I'm not confident that it's what measurements do we decide people are performing by. In these companies, I see something entirely different. And that is that people have leaders and mentors who are expected to guide them and know whether or not they're doing a good job and help them to do a good job and deal with issues if they don't. That's not a metric. That's not a piece of paper that you look at in your office. It's a, do we have good leaders that know how to create and keep the teams performing well? What James Parker says is that, and he has 2 chapters in the book, Doing the Right Thing, saying, great companies have great leaders at every level. And then the next chapter is, in case you didn't get it, great companies have great leaders at every level. And it's the leaders at every level that create the environment to make sure that people are doing the right thing. So every time people talk about, oh, somebody isn't performing well, what do? I always say, well, where's their manager? I mean, isn't it the job of a leader to make sure that people are performing well or have issues that are taken care of? So rather than what metrics, it's do we have leaders that are capable of leading teams that work appropriately? An interesting thing you can think about is the book that we just wrote has a subtitle, Results Are Not the Point. Okay, results are not the point. The point is to create an environment where people can perform well and where the systems work together. So in the military, you can say results are the point if you happen to be at war. But if you're not at war, results are not the point. The point is to create a training environment and a leadership environment so should you happen to have to be in a serious situation, you can react appropriately as a local team. It's the same thing for paramedics, for firefighters. The idea is not to put out fires, it's to create readiness and preparedness so that when something happens, you have teams that know what to do and how to do. So it's about training and leadership as opposed to creating the results. Even in business, it's as much about training and leadership as it is about creating results. So I'll disagree with you, Hannah, as she says managers are responsible for delivering results, and I will say no, actually I think results are not the point. Any more questions? Yes?
So I was wondering, with Amazon proliferation of services, how do they go about not optimizing suboptimally, optimizing the whole? What's in place there?
Oh, I see this as a way of thinking about optimizing the whole. Okay? Because what they're trying to do is create independent agents that agent teams that independently understand their piece in the big picture and be very creative in that big picture of delivering stuff. But if you look at Vogel's videos, every single time he talks about it in the context of me shopping. He says, well, you wouldn't do this because you wouldn't want a shopper that would not be able to put something in their basket. So, to my opinion, everybody that does something is focused on me, the shopper, being able to buy stuff. And because of that, they have that sort of customer outcome vision as to what is right. And so anything that prevents me, the shopper, from being able to put something in my basket and buy it is not considered appropriate. Vogels was a professor at Cornell working in the area of very large databases. And he got hired. They have sort of a team management structure in their IT department where there are 3 or 4 that work as a team together in order to sort of create the environment. More questions? Oh, there's one last question. Okay.
So you were talking about the not agreeing between services is hard, and I just wanted to ask you to clarify that a little. What does that mean?
Okay, so think about internet. Basically, before TCP/IP was mandated in 1982, there was a network control protocol with IMPs, little pieces of hardware. And the problem back then was that if somebody would send out a request, it would have to be acknowledged. And so they were having lockups. So one of the architectural things of TCP/IP is that communications is on a best efforts basis. So you know that if somebody sends you an email, you will probably get it, but maybe not. And it happens with all internet communication because if on internet everything has to be acknowledged, it would lock up tomorrow. No, excuse me, 1 minute from now. So you can't have acknowledgement of every transmission on internet. Similarly, Amazon is in the same scale. So you cannot have acknowledgement of every single transmission because you would lock up instantly. And so when you have massive scale and volume, You cannot demand agreement also. That's what he's talking about. Make sense? Okay, well, thanks, everybody. I think we resume in a half an hour then.